Hello, my name is James Cunningham. I'm a teacher. I'm also the co-founder of the education resource site Mr.A, Mr.C, Mr.D Presents, and I have also published research on mathematics and working memory. What we're going to be talking about today is working memory in particular, and thinking about what it is, how is it different to short-term memory, and how is it important, and how can we practice and apply that in the classroom. Today, more than at any other time, a great emphasis is being placed on recalling information and building opportunities in your lessons to think back on what children have learnt in the past, building up a memory bank. But what do we mean by human memory? Because often these things are brought together under one banner, and actually teasing them apart can be very important to understanding human memory. The eminent psychologist Alan Baddeley subdivides human memory into three fundamental parts. The first of which is sensory memory, and this is a residual imprint of some sensory event. For example, if you were to look at a light bulb for a few seconds and then close your eyes, you'd still be able to see a residual imprint in your mind's eye of that light bulb. This is an example of sensory memory. Now, that sensory input then feeds through to our next memory system, which is short-term memory. Now, what's often misunderstood about short-term memory is short-term memory refers to memory over a few seconds. Often at the chalk face, people talk about short-term memory being over a whole day or over a few days, in fact, and actually we're talking about a few seconds of memory storage. This short-term memory system is actually subdivided into two fundamental parts. One is short-term memory, which is actually just remembering that information over a few seconds. And the other part of that is the working memory, which is being able to manipulate that memory in your mind's eye. For example, if I were to give you 3 digits and ask you to reverse them in your head, so if I gave the digits 6, 7, 4, and then ask you to reverse those and say them back to me, this would be a very good example of having to store the information with your short-term memory system and then use your working memory to be able to manipulate that in your mind's eye at the same time. The last of those 3 categories is long-term memory, and that's subdivided into semantic memory and episodic memory. This is best understood as an episodic memory being when you recalled a particular day, maybe your last birthday or a particular memorable event, and the semantic information being something that is useful in a multitude of different ways, the understanding of a particular word or a learnt phrase or a learnt mathematical formula, for example. Today we're going to be focusing on short-term memory, particularly as this is vitally important for learning itself. Now, Alan Baddeley subdivides short-term memory system into 3 different things. We have the central executive or working memory, where we can manipulate information, a cognitive workbench or a sketch pad where we can put together all ideas. And then there are 2 other components which are our short-term memory storage banks. One of those is the phonological loop, an auditory system where we can hear in our heads a loop of a sentence, for example. If somebody asks you to remember a telephone number and they read it to you and you sub-vocalise, you repeat that to yourself. This is you using your phonological loop to help remember that information. And then we have the visual spatial sketch pad. Now, this is an area where we can draw elements of pictures and concepts of size into our mind. For example, if I were to ask you to imagine a purple armchair that was rotating around in your head, this would be a very good example of you using your visual spatial sketchpad. Here's another classic example of a working memory task that's often seen on SATs papers. Here the child has to piece together this net of a cube and say whether or not the 2 dots would meet if the net was made into a complete 3D shape. This is an example of having to use the visual spatial sketchpad, and at the same point of time has a degree of executive functioning. Therefore, it's using visual working memory to be able to manipulate the object that's being stored. When we're putting those things together, when we're turning them around, when we're manipulating them, this is an example of working memory. And working memory is also used in activating memories stored in the hippocampus, so long-term memories. So in recalling long-term memories, this is an activity that involves our working memory system too, and also suppressing them, curiously enough. So if there's a particular, let's say there's a siren going on in the background during your classroom, it's going to require a lot of working memory for those children to filter that out and not associate any experiences with those sirens, or think about A&E, or think about an ambulance and those sorts of things. So the working memory is critical to learning because it is a filter through which almost everything that we learn passes through. Working memory is developmental, and so it does increase in terms of its efficiency and capacity with age. We know that it peaks around children's 15th year. Thereafter it plateaus somewhat until the mid-30s, where actually we see a slight decline in working memory performance. It's limited by its efficiency and its capacity. Now let's break those two things down, because they're both important in the learning process. So the capacity of one's working memory, this is how much information can you hold and manipulate at the same time. And that's going to be different for every individual. In terms of the efficiency, this is heavily affected by language. So, for example, one finds that in Chinese it's much easier to store number than it is in European languages, and so one can assume that cognitively somehow the sounds of numbers are more efficient in Chinese than they are in European languages. Another example of the efficiency of working memory being considered in the classroom is if a child's asked to do some sort of calculation in the 3 times table. They may well start from 0, 3, 6, 9 and count up until they get to the correct number. Now cognitively this is quite a heavy tool, because they're having to store a whole sequence of numbers temporarily in their head to get to the one that they need. Whereas if they might even know that one off by heart and they rephrase that in a particular way, they might be able to get to the answer much quicker and use their memory much more efficiently. Another example of using one's working memory more efficiently is making a jotting so that one doesn't have to store that information. So you're only storing the essential information, so that one can get to the conclusion quicker and more efficiently. Why is working memory so important? Well, put simply, it's critical for following instructions. So one has to be very mindful of children's working memory capacity when setting instructions and telling children to start tasks. It's critical in terms of controlling our own attention, our working memory capacity. So often we find if there are children who have poor working memory, they'll often struggle to focus their attention on one thing and will experience attentional switching. It's critical in being able to read effectively and write effectively, because those two processes require dynamic thought and simultaneous auditory storage. And it's critical for thinking about maths, and particularly manipulating number in mental maths. Partitioning and recombining and these sorts of things require storing some information and at the same time manipulating another part of it. It's also, as we've already said, critical for having an effective uptake into long-term memory through what's called the episodic buffer. So if the information is not being processed effectively in one's working memory, it's not going to be filtered through and stored effectively in the long-term memory. Let's consider an example of where understanding working memory is really critical in the classroom. So there's a child in your class that frequently you tell the children your instructions. This is what we're going to be doing in our work today. You check the learning objective, all that sort of stuff. You've told them now. We're going to stand up. We're going to go to our tables, pick up your pencil, open your book, and begin your work. And everybody else has gone to their tables, and this one child is just left wandering around the classroom. Maybe they've got a pencil in their hand, they're just fiddling with the pencil, and they're just wandering around. Now, for you as a practitioner, what you have to think is, why is this child doing that? Why are they doing that? It could be that they're distracted by a noise or by some sort of visual noise that's compelling them to go to that particular area of the classroom. It could be that they have no interest in the work. It could be that they are being deliberately disobedient to try and get your attention. There are lots of reasons that could be, but often in this situation, the child has simply forgotten what they're supposed to be doing. And we are often very guilty as practitioners for giving children too many instructions for their working memory capacity. And so your job then is to consider this in the future and try and make sure this working memory failure does not happen again. These guide working memory capacities are from Working Memory and Learning by Gathercole and Alloway, and most practitioners that have seen these statistics for the first time are taken aback at how low they are. One might say, if you are teaching 5 and 6 year olds, what can you teach if you are only giving them 2 instructions? Well, of course, the answer is that actually, these are novel instructions, so new instructions, but you can give a child 2 instructions, and then you can give them another 2 instructions, and you can give them another 2 instructions, and you can give them another 2 instructions, and actually then they can accomplish almost anything. But you would have to very much consider breaking your lessons down to be able to make sure that you are providing that, so that you're not expecting a 6-year-old to follow 6 instructions without some sort of mnemonic to help them in that respect. One of the ways that you can use this information about working memory as a teacher is when you're planning your lessons, you need to be very cognizant of how can I get children to accomplish something without having to remember something. So non-essential information can be recorded on a board, it can be recorded on a table, it can be presented using pictures so that children can use it as a frame of reference and they're not having to remember that themselves without any other memory aids around the classroom. Likewise, when you are asking children to focus on their learning and complete an activity, you need to be very mindful that you are following those limits and thinking, right, well, if this lesson is about using this particular set of adjectives, for example, then that is the focus for those children. If they are then bombarded in input with 6 or 7 other things to include in their writing, they are simply going to forget most of that list of things you've asked them to use. Working memory difficulties are associated with a number of special educational needs, including Down syndrome, ADHD, autism, and dyslexia. If you suspected a child in your class had one of these conditions or was showing symptoms of having that condition, then you would refer to your Senko, and they would probably have a battery of tests which would include some working memory assessments. Let's have a think now about how professionals assess the working memory. One of the long-standing and classic ways of assessing one's working memory is to do a simple digit recall test. Now, this is where one reads a series of numbers, often with a second pause in between them, and then you have to recall them after a certain waiting period. And then each of the people that sit that test are given a score based on the maximum number of random digits that they can remember. Let's have a go at that now and see how you do. 6, 4, 3, 2, 7. Now tell me back those numbers. Now, a very similar test is the backwards digit span. The first one is often criticised as it is now more latterly thought of as a test of short-term memory, just memory storage. It's not got that element of manipulation that is required of a working memory task. So the backward digit span is a very good example of this. Now, this is used in current aerospace training programs, and if you've had the pleasure of watching the aerospace training program thing on the BBC at the moment, one of the tests that the candidates had to go through was the backward digit span test, and they were also made to do some step-ups at the same time, which is another thing for your body to be processing, a haptic stimulus for you to be processing at the same time, and so it's increasing that cognitive load, it's increasing that working memory load, making the task harder to do. So for the backward digit span, one has to not just remember those numbers, but one then has to present them in reverse order. So we're going to have a go at doing that with just 5 digits. 9, 3, 5, 2, 1. Now try and remember them in reverse order. Another assessment method is the sentence recall test. Here is an example of that. I'm going to read you 4 sentences, and what I want you to do is remember the last word of each of the sentences. And when we get to the 4th sentence, if you can, say each of those 4 words. So here we go. The greengrocer sold many apples and oranges. The hedgehog has an unusual amount of spines. The sailor had been around the world frequently. The bookseller crossed the room, scowled, and threw a book at the chair. Now recall each of the last words. Similar in nature to the sentence recall test is a true or false logical reasoning test. This sort of assessment usually requires one to read a sentence and then afterwards ask a question, and that true or false has to apply to that sentence. For example, 3 yellow ducks and a red duck crossed the road. All the ducks were yellow, true or false. Now, this sort of sentence, obviously that was quite a simple example, that sort of example is actually used still today for when divers go deep sea diving and they're checking whether they have got the bends, whether they are performing cognitively well under those stressful diving conditions. And it takes advantage also, quite often the question at the end will involve a negative, and if you work with small children you'll know that it actually requires more processing for us to to process a negative instruction than it does to process a positive one. So, for example, if you say, "Don't hit your brother," then a toddler might just hear, "hit your brother," and they won't process that negative. Another really great example of an assessment method used for working memory is the Corsi block test. Now, this is one that's very easy to do something similar in the classroom. It involves having a series of blocks set out in front of you. Now, Corsi himself suggested we had 9 blocks, and we had a particular layout for them, but you can have a randomized layout, and one person points to a series of blocks, and the other person has to then point to those same blocks in the same order, and they have to recall both the blocks themselves and the order in which they were done. And the test gets harder and harder and harder until mistakes are made, and then one stops the test. Lastly, and equally this is one that's very easy to transfer into the classroom, is the Nback test. Now, the Nback test is essentially recalling the answer from the question before. So if you can do that effectively, if you can recall the answer from the question before, then that means you've got an Nback of 1. Now, if you can then recall the answer from 2 questions ago, then you've got an Nback 2 score, and so on and so forth. Now, in the classroom, a very simple game to play that establishes straight away a very crude Nback result for your class is playing the game Switch. So if you say, put your hands on your shoulders, do this, do this, do this, that's the sort of thing you'd see all the time in a classroom. But if you start doing that and you ask them to do the thing before, so you'd say, now the children would put their hands on their shoulders. Now the children would put their hands on their head. Now the children would make goggles with their eyes. That activity is much harder to do. And what you'll find in your classrooms is that as soon as you ask them to do that and follow the action before, children stop talking because they can't process talking and following that instruction, because they're having to use their working memory system to store that information and manipulate it. Whereas quite often, and I've done this lots of time, if you ask children to do this, do this, do this, they can do that and they can talk at the same time, because actually it doesn't require a lot of them to do exactly what you are doing. It doesn't require a lot of storage or manipulation. So in conclusion, as a teacher, you've got 2 important jobs to do. You have to teach to children's strengths, but you also have to develop children's weaknesses. In this regard, one has to reduce the working memory load of certain activities, and certainly for those with special educational needs. And the way we do that is by having clear success criteria, not giving too many instructions, giving children frequent reminders, using manipulatives in maths so they're not having to use their mind, or using jottings so they're not having to store that information mentally. The other task that you have is to also build opportunities for children to be able to practice their working memory skills. You can certainly work on the efficiency of their working memory by teaching them more efficient mental maths strategies, for example. You can also make sure that you're teaching children how to remember things. For example, you could ask a child to remember the number 15 whilst they were doing something else, but you could ask them to remember it by imagining it as a giant inflatable number, or giving it a colour, for example, or asking a child to, with their hands, put a number on a shelf. I'd like you to put the number 153 on a dusty shelf in your head. When they are doing that, then they're engaging more of their brain and engaging different areas of their brain to help that storage of that number. But we're helping teach them how to use their visual spatial sketchpad, and we're teaching them how to use their phonological loop. For example, there's certainly benefit for certain children to be told or to be prompted to subvertically rehearse something. So if I were to give you a telephone number that you had to remember, you would naturally repeat that back to yourself until you could write it down, whereas younger children certainly don't do that spontaneously, and certain children with special educational needs such as Down syndrome might not learn to do that spontaneously, and so there is benefit to actually saying, I'd like you to say this in your head. This sort of thing is often something that we would do more naturally in reading. So we'd ask children to whisper it to themselves in their head, or to sound it out in their head before saying the word and blending it together. Many of these strategies that you could use to develop working memory in the classroom, you may already be using as part of bread and butter good teaching. For example, in a literacy lesson, you could show a picture of the countryside. Now, they are looking at that picture, they're using their visual spatial sketchpad to store some of that information. But then if you were to say, oh, what's off to the left of this picture, or what's in the sky, they're going to then have to use their imagination, and they're going to have to store the information that they've got in front of them, but they're also going to have to build on that using their working memory. Or if you're doing some sort of guided meditation, or you're asking the children to close their eyes and say, tell me more about, or what can you see behind the door. All of these ideas where we're developing children's imagination, we're being more explicit about what we're asking children to think, how we're asking to think them. Are we asking them to draw a picture in their mind's eye? Are we asking them to manipulate something in their mind's eye, make that picture move in some way? Are we asking them to recall a number? Are we asking them to recall a feeling or a past experience? And as a teacher, it's good practice to be really clear about to children what you want them to do in their mind's eye, and how they can engage their imagination, how they can engage their working memory as part of your daily teaching routine. Working memory is a developing area. My research was into whether we could improve the working memory of children through training, and this is something that has been explored in the context of special educational needs for some time. At the moment, the results are still inconclusive, unfortunately. It's considered good practice for children with Down syndrome, for example, to have regular points of engagement with memory activities, such as playing a simple memory card game, for example, or playing Spot the Difference. These sorts of things make up the background of what is a very good educational diet, but it's very hard to tease apart those specific activities and say these have in and of themselves a material impact on that child's working memory outside of all of the other factors. What we do know is children's working memory does improve when they learn to read. So there is a lot of data that suggests that is true. So teaching children to read does improve their working memory. Some people would say, therefore, if teaching children to read can improve their working memory, then there are certain educational activities that we can do regularly which can have a material impact on those children's cognition, their working memory. And if they have that an improved working memory, a more efficient and more dynamic cognitive workspace, then they are going to be very successful at thinking. Thank you for listening to this discussion about working memory today, and I hope that you take some of these ideas and put them into practice in your own schools. Thank you very much.